Fourth level of learning, Paper 8, The Orion and the Artemis Myth, The Real Story of Isis and Genetic Manipulation, by Wes Penray Publications. Written on Thursday, October 31, 2013. Edited by Professor Bob Stannard. Introduction to the Orion and Artemis Myth. The Orion and Artemis story is these days related to Greek and Roman mythology, but the story itself is much more ancient. I am telling this story to the readers because it's highly relevant to Gaia's history, and what really happened here on Earth after Prince Ninurta and most of his team managed to escape from the trap, which Lucifer tried to close after the Titan War. As usual, much of the evidence lies in our old mythology, which is nothing more and nothing less than allegories of what truly happened. The scribes, especially those who were real historians and wanted to preserve the history for coming generations, found themselves living under a regime of a controlling god force, which wouldn't allow them to tell the true story. Hence, the truth had to be hidden in allegories, metaphors, and sometimes in pure fairy tales. Still, it was written in such a way that those who wanted to know would find the truth in these mythological stories. Artemis was, in Greek mythology, the most widely venerated of the ancient deities, and her Roman counterpart is Diana. Some scholars believe that Artemis is another name for Mother Goddess herself, an idea that was actually pre-Greek. We can see Artemis and Diana both being equated to the goddess in many references throughout time, and if we read the story and interpret it, we can quite clearly see that this must be the case. In mythology, Artemis and Orion were hunting partners, and they were good friends. Some say that they even loved each other. Both Artemis and Orion are often depicted with arrow and bow, as a symbol for being hunters. The myth says regarding Artemis, her symbols included the golden bow and arrow, the hunting dog, the stag, and the moon. Then, if we research Orion, we find that he is a great hunter as well, and he is often seen carrying a sword or a bow and arrow, being an archer. So, it is becoming obvious that the bow and arrow are associated with the constellation of Orion, hence, the Orion Empire. Also, I showed in paper 2, that Prince Enlil and Prince Ninurta are one and the same. So, lo and behold, what do we often see Ninurta carrying? Exactly, the arrow and bow. This proves that Enlil, as we know him from Sitchin, and most other sources, did not come from Sirius but from the Orion Empire. This is a schoolbook example of how important it is to look into mythology to understand our history, and in this case, to understand where the different gods originate from. I would like to start by telling the Orion and Artemis story from a mythological standpoint, so that afterward I can show the reader who is who in this story, and who does what to whom, and why. I will refer to references that the original storyteller wanted you to see, but perhaps not those who were, and still are, in charge of this planet. This is why it can be of importance sometimes that the researchers are not scholars, or have a PhD in any of the subjects that may relate to ancient mythology or alternative history, etc., because as such, there is a great chance that they may already have been led to think in certain terms, which have been set by the establishment as the norm. Usually, it's better to start without any indoctrination and look with a totally open mind. How otherwise would we be able to find our way out of the maze of information out there? Information that also was manipulated by the very same men of power who history is supposed to reveal. The original, ethical scribes, however, obviously took this into consideration, and perhaps, but I don't know, they counted on ordinary people to find the way. The mythological version of the story. Orion was Artemis's hunting champion, and they became the best of friends. Still, they never copulated, hence, they had no offspring. Apollo noticed the close friendship between Orion and Artemis, and instantly became jealous. Therefore, he created a scorpion in order to kill Orion. Orion jumped into the water and tried to swim away from the scorpion, which was very determined to sting Orion. While this was ongoing, Apollo hurried over to Artemis and told her that there was a man who had raped one of her priestesses. Artemis got furious and asked Apollo who this criminal man was, and Apollo pointed at Orion, who was swimming in the water. Artemis had no idea that Orion was actually swimming for his life from the poisonous scorpion, which Apollo said after him. Instead, she thought he tried to escape his fate after having been exposed for his crime. Artemis, in her fury and sadness over how her best of friends could commit this horrible crime to one of her own priestesses, grabbed her bow, set an arrow to its string, aimed, and shot it at the swimming Orion, who was fatally wounded and died. Here it is uncertain whether he actually died from both Artemis's arrow and the sting from the scorpion or solely from the arrow. Afterward, when Artemis confronted the priestess, who was pointed out by Apollo to be the one who was raped by Orion, she found out that it was all a lie, and Orion had never raped her. Artemis became inconsolable and ran out in the water, trying to revive her old friend and hunting partner, to no avail. Orion was dead. In her grief, Artemis then flung his body into the sky, and he became the constellation of Orion. Then she flung the scorpion, Apollo's murderous creation, into the sky as well, landing at Orion's heel and thus became the constellation of Scorpio. Interpretation of the story. On the surface, this is a story of jealousy, but the real meaning goes deeper than that. This is carefully revealing the characters of certain gods, and it's more about betrayal, manipulation, and power. This story is told in a few different versions, depending on which scholar you are asking, but when push comes to shove, it seems like most of them agree with the story I relayed here. I agree with these scholars as well because it fits right into the story I have been trying to tell in 4 different series of papers. Artemis, as we already have discussed, is the goddess herself, but who then is Orion? Well, first, the story is very careful to point out that the goddess and Orion did not have a sexual relationship. So, could Orion perhaps be con-enlil? Hypothetically, he could. In fact, although the Khan and the Queen are considered married from a human perspective, they do not have sex like we do. The Queen, indeed, does not even need a partner in that respect because if she wants to give birth to a son, she keeps her egg unfertilized, but if she wants a daughter, she fertilizes the egg herself, from being androgynous in nature. Although Con-Enlil could be Orion, I am confident he isn't. What we need to do is to look, not only at the mythos again, but also at other sources because Orion's origins has been quite well covered up. A source that is perhaps not used as often as it should are the ancient tarot cards, which also relate to different gods, asterisms, and very ancient stories. In this one, Orion is correctly equated to Ninurta, Prince Enlil. The first image's detail of Ninurta, Orion, standing next to a lion, sacred animal of Inanna, and symbol of Sirius. Second image, the complete picture from the ancient Sumerian seal of Edda. Third, is of Ninurta enthroned with image of double-headed eagle. Fourth, Orion and Canis major detail from cylinder seal. Further details at end. Unfortunately, this website does not present the images that are referred to, but we can still point out a few quite interesting correlations between Ninurta and Orion. In the first image, Ninurta, Orion, is related to Sirius via the lion, although the lion is not necessarily connected to Sirius, but more so to Orion. The reference to Inanna and Sirius is correct, here showing Ninurta's connection to Inanna more than to Sirius itself. Inanna, however, does have Sirian connections, which we will discuss later. The reference in image 3, to a double-headed eagle, on the other hand, is a direct reference to Orion, and consequently, so is image 4. As a side note, while we're still on the tarot website, It also gives a relatively correct reference to the vastness of the Orion Empire. Orion is one of the oldest known constellations. The bands of Orion refer to the three apparently equally spaced stars that form the belt of Orion, an easily identifiable locational aid. Followed north they lead the eye to Aldebaran, south to Sirius, two bright stars of calendrical and navigational importance, directional and seasonal markers. Above to the right is the constellation of Taurus, to the left, Gemini. The constellation was thought of as a cosmic giant. His arms extended measure half the skies, his stride no less. This is quite interesting because, as we can see, there were many ways by which the ancients hid the truth in plain sight, for those who have eyes to see, and ears to hear, as the saying goes. Here it is done through the tarot cards. However, in the end, the mythos tells it all. If we research Ninurta, we will find that he is the god of the hunt, and Artemis is the goddess of the hunt. They were not lovers, in fact, they were mother and son, whose relationship is becoming distorted by a third party, Apollo. Because this story has different versions, wherein one of them, Apollo as being the liar and traitor, I chose him only to show the readers that he goes under many epithets. Another being with even more epithets, as it seems, is Zeus. Apollo's and Zeus' relation to each other is a curious and interesting one, indeed. Most records indicate that Apollo is the son of Zeus. Thus far, most scholars agree. However, that seems to be where the agreement ends. The question is, who is Zeus? Well, I showed clearly in paper 2 that one of Lord Enki's aliases is Zeus, and I believe that is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So, if Apollo is the son of Zeus, who then is Apollo? The reader may have figured that out now. Yes, Apollo is an alias for Lord Marduk. I know there are researchers who embrace Apollo as the good guy, so before anyone begins to associate too much with such research, it's best to think twice about who such a researcher is promoting and start looking for motives that may be counter-survival to mankind. I don't mean to say that everybody who promotes Apollo as being the good guy is intentionally spreading disinformation, but it's disinformation, nonetheless. In the above version of the Artemis story, the traitor and the liar is no one other than Lord Marduk. But, I also said that there are other versions of the story as well, and in some of them, it wasn't Apollo, but Zeus, who sent the scorpion on Orion. Either way, father and son may both be guilty of that crime. If Enki was involved, which I see as a very high possibility, he lied to, and betrayed, both this mother, Artemis, and his brother, Ninurta. Mind you that many of these mythos are either analogies or metaphors. Prince Ninurta was, of course, never killed. He is still alive today, as are Enki and Marduk. But the story is telling us about the general characters of the beings involved, and that some are willing to go as far as murdering their own family in order to gain power that they don't have, except when they steal it from others. Ladies of Fire. The above interesting mythological story brings us directly to the biblical Garden of Eden and what actually happened there. We have another quite illuminating myth, showing us precisely what happened in Eden. But first, let us see how Enki managed to break into Prince Ninurta's abandoned mountain paradise, the real Garden of Eden here on Earth. Enki was frustrated because he couldn't break the spell and the magic which stopped any intruder from entering Eden from the outside. Regardless of how much he tried, it was beyond his ability. Here was something that his mother apparently hadn't taught him, and that made him even more frustrated. There was only one thing to do. He set guards around the places where 4 rivers wriggled their way in between the high mountain sides. These rivers seemed to be the only entrances to whatever was beyond these inaccessible mountains. He put some of his most trustworthy military men to guard what looked like 4 entrances, and these guards had orders to contact him immediately if something out of the ordinary occurred. When something eventually did occur, Enki just happened to be close by and hurried over as quickly as he could. It was dusk and hard to see, but one of the guards pointed him in the right direction. No one knew how it happened or where they came from, but perhaps 500 yards away, about a dozen female beings had suddenly become visible by the riverbed, outside the mountains. Enki could hear them laugh, and it seemed like they were gathering something from the ground in baskets that they were carrying. It was hard to see. Enki grabbed a pair of binoculars with night vision to get a better view. What he saw were 12 tall and beautiful females with long, red hair. None of them were wearing any clothes, and Enki was absolutely stunned by their beauty. He couldn't take his eyes away from them and immediately felt the urge to mate with them. He was wondering how many more of these females were on the other side of the mountains and whether there were any males there. He highly doubted that there were any males because he recognized androgyny when he saw it. Still, that wouldn't have to stop him from having sex with them. Without scaring them away, he needed to determine either how to approach them or follow them back the same way they came. Something told him, however, that if he did the latter, he would not be allowed to enter, the females would disappear, and he would lose his opportunity. The women suddenly stopped and looked up at the moon. They pointed at it and said something which Enki couldn't hear. He, too, looked, noticing it was a full moon. In fact, it looked much bigger back in these days because it was closer to the earth. This allowed beings, animals, and plants to be larger in size and taller than they are today. Not until after the flood, 11,500 BC, did Enki move the moon away so that it became more distant. The moon has a lot to do with locking us into this particular frequency band in which the AIF can control us. Figure 4. The magic entrance to Ninurta's mountain paradise, the Garden of Eden. Enki recognized the pattern of these women. They were shamans. They had the power to put up the veil around their domains because of their shamanic abilities, he thought. They were women of fire. Enki suddenly got even more excited, but this time it was not only sexual, he could really use these women. A few minutes later, the females were gone, as if they were disappearing in thin air, but Enki let them go without interfering. Now he knew, and he had plans. He told his men that they didn't need to be on watch anymore, and he'll take over from there. The story of Isis. Before we continue with what Enki did next and the exposure of his grand plan, we need to go back in time, before Marduk was even born, because it's common knowledge that at least Marduk was involved in manipulating records, and I would add Enki, as well. We can expect that much of the distortion is related to these two beings. This is certainly the case. Most records say that Marduk was the son of Enki, Ea and Damkina. Then, if we start researching Damkina, it won't take long until we find out that she represents Mother Goddess herself in most of the texts. Already there, we have a serious contradiction because we know from other, much more coherent research, that Enki was never married to his mother, the goddess. Hence, we have reasons to believe that either Damkina was not the mother goddess, or Enki was never married to Damkina. There are no convincing records saying that Damkina is not another name for the goddess, so I believe I can say with some confidence that she actually is the goddess. If this being the case, then with whom was Enki married? Of course, we also know that Enki was very promiscuous, so the question can in itself be quite irrelevant. Enki has children everywhere. However, what we are interested in right now is to establish who is the mother of Marduk. There is hardly any doubt that Enki is his father. This is where things become complicated, but to begin, I am going to show to the readers that Inanna, Ishtar, and Isis are all one and the same deity. Hang in there because this will turn out to be very important. Moreover, I want to hypothesize that Horus, whom according to the myth is the son of Osiris, and Isis, is no one other than Marduk himself. Many readers have probably seen the connection over time between Isis and Horus, Ishtar who nurses the god Tammuz, and Mary and Jesus, to name a few. There are more. Those who want to prove that Jesus never existed, Use this as an example. They show that history in fact repeats itself and that the Jesus myth is nothing but the Isis, Horus, and the Ishtar, Tammuz stories all over again. In fact, similar stories are used to manipulate and confuse and control people in the name of religion and cults. By telling a comparable story over time, people get hooked on different belief systems. Usually, there is one basic story that has truth to it, but the rest are just manipulated versions of the first one. My case in point here is that just like the scholar of comparative mythology, Joseph Campbell, I find the Isis, Horus and Ishtar, Tammuz stories identical enough to consider them being one and the same. This means that Isis and Ishtar in that case would be the same deity. Moreover, Ishtar and Inanna are already proven, by scholars, to be one and the same. Ishtar is her name in Babylon, and Inanna is her counterpart in Mesopotamia, Sumer. Then, if the above is true, the fact is that Isis, being the mother of Horus, is also the mother of Marduk because Horus and Marduk are one and the same. Some scholars have already made the connection that all these female deities, Inanna, Ishtar, Lilith, and Isis are identical. Enki in this regard is then, of course, Osiris. There is a reason why I am revealing that Enki and Isis are Marduk's parents. I want to make this entire family connection known because it has a great impact upon the rest of the story. However, there is more, as we writers usually say. Another interesting side note that gets revealed via the above hypothesis is that Isis is also Prince Ninurta's daughter. This becomes obvious because according to the most general ancient records, Ishtar is the daughter of Ninurta, and we just discussed that Ishtar, Inanna, and Isis are all one and the same. I hope I haven't lost the reader now with all these different names for the same deities. Not every star being has multiple names, but in this case, a few of them do, such as Enki and his trolls who have taken on the names of other deities, and changed names and events around as it pleases them, in order to keep the control system going. Also, as noted earlier, a deity almost always had different names in different locations, depending on which time period we're talking about. However, to make things a little less confusing, this is the result of what we have discussed thus far. 1. Enki's consort is said to be Damkana, who is actually the goddess herself, according to most records. Instead, at one point, Isis, Ishtar, Inanna became Enki's consort. 2. From the relationship between Enki, Osiris and Inanna, Ishtar, Isis, Marduk, also known as Horus, was born. According to many ancient records, Isis gave birth to Horus, but as we have noticed, many stories correlate, and instead I suggest that Horus and Marduk are one and the same. Their stories may differ in some regard, but they are still close enough, and the Isis, Marduk connection opens up new doors that were closed before, as the reader is about to find out. 3. Isis, according to the research I'm providing here, is also Ninurta's, Prince Enlil's, daughter. This is actually all there is to it so far, but these 3 points are going to become very significant. Hence, what took some explanation to reveal is showing to be quite simple when we summarize it. The big, happy family is therefore Enki, Isis, and Marduk. Then, from earlier discussions, see paper 2, I have proven beyond doubts that Ninhursag and Mother Goddess are also one and the same, which means that Ninhursag was never helping Enki engineer mankind and had nothing to do with his genetic experiments. In reality, she was strongly against them and considered what Enki did to be a serious crime, and the destruction of her own living library that she and her son, Prince Ninurta, had created to near perfection was not something she looked lightly upon. However, if we exchange Ninhursag with Isis, we are getting much closer to the truth. Thus, we get the expression, Genesis, or the genes of Isis, which, if I recall correctly, was coined by Michael Zarion, researcher, but was also used by me as a title of one of my Level I papers. In other words, I am suggesting that Isis was Enki's female partner and master geneticist, and Isis was thus contributing her DNA to the human body, as did Enki. Isis also has connections to the Sirius star system. Isis is often seen wearing a throne on her head, which indicates her royal connection to Sirius. Unbeknownst to many, however, she is also representing Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the greater and the lesser bear, through her father, Prince Ninurta, and her grandparents, the Queen of Orion and Kan Enlil. Allegedly, it was after her encounters with Enki that she was rewarded the throne of Sirius, as he himself had claimed that domain after some agreements with the locals. However, Isis' bloodline is still that of Orion, through her father, Ninurta. It is still true that we humans have Syrian blood running in our veins, but that is even truer when it comes to the global elite bloodlines, something I will talk more about later. A backdoor into the KHAA. Lord Enki's plan was simple but, in his own eyes, ingenious. He knew that he would never inherit the throne of Orion, regardless of what he was trying to do in order to win the Queen's sympathies, therefore, he had to try any other measures he could think of. His new plan was that if he managed to get Isis as his bride, he would have another foot into the inner sanctuaries of the Orion Empire on her merit, and best of all, she was his brother's daughter. He knew that Ninurta would hate to see him married to her daughter, so that became part of his revenge. He wanted to make sure that everybody knew not to mess with Prince Lucifer. Proud of himself and his brilliant ego, he left for Ursa Minor, where Isis was dwelling at the moment. He found her and spoke with her with his seducing and most charming voice, which he'd been so famous for while he was still Prince Lucifer. The first step of his plan was to manipulate her to come with him to Gaia. He said that he wanted to put things in perspective and explain to her why he thought he'd been treated so badly by the Orion court. He also wanted to show Isis who she really was. His plan worked, and they both went back to Earth. As soon as Enki had the chance, he took Isis aside and brutally raped her. According to Isis herself, at a later account, there was nothing she could do to stop him at that moment, there was no one else around, and she had no crystal or other communication device which she could use to quickly ask for help. She realized that she had been too gullible, but the fact remained, before she knew it, the rape was complete. This rape produced a son, who was later going to become very famous, or infamous rather. The son's name was Marduk. At first, Isis was crushed and didn't know what to do, but Enki consoled her and continued to manipulate her with his soothing voice. He even wrote a poem to her, although the poem was more about Enki's own magnificence. I am not sure how she took that, but ultimately, Enki manipulated her to be what he wanted her to be. This is from Inelma Ellis. My father, ruler above and below, made my features blaze above and below. My great brother, ruler of all the lands, gathered all the me together, placed the me in my hands. From the Eker, house of Enlil, I passed on the arts and crafts to my Abzu, Eridu. I am the true offspring, sprung from the wild ox. I am a leading son of An. I am the great storm that breaks over the great below. I am the great lord over the land. I am the first among the rulers. I am the father of all the lands. I am the big brother of the gods. The haggle is perfected in me. I am the seal keeper above and below. I am cunning and wise in the lands. I am the one who directs justice alongside An, the king, on the days of An. I am the one who, having gazed upon the core, decrees the fates alongside Enlil. He has placed in my hands the decreeing of fates at the place where the sun rises. I am the one Nintur really cares for. I am the one Nintursa gave a good name. I am the leader of the Inanna gods. After seducing and hypnotizing Isis and feeding her with more what's in it for you and what's in it for me, he threw out the punchline. Beautiful lady of the lesser heavens, neither you, nor I, can ever be the ruler of Orion on his or her own, and I think you are born a queen. but not over simple domains such as Sirius, Ursa Major, or Ursa Minor. You deserve the title, Queen of Orion, and I deserve to be king, and you know it. I'm the firstborn, so why did they choose my brother before me? Do you think that's right? Come and marry me, and we will make a strong bloodline. Together we can bypass your father and become the true heirs of Orion. What do you think? Isis looked at Enki and saw his power, or at least the power he seductively emitted toward her, and then looked at her little son, lying in the cradle, and thought that she wanted the best for her son. Hence, she nodded and said yes to Enki's proposal. Enki smiled inside. His plan had been magnificent, indeed. Enki, Isis, and Marduk, thus born here on Earth, now became a family, and Enki had people create a wedding for the two, a wedding, which had to be the most magnificent one in the history of Sector 9, said Enki. Thereafter, the two became one. Later, when Marduk grew up to become a man and a trained Dakh warrior, he was given Alpha Draconis, Thuban, as his domain, as well as Ursa Minor. These were both strategic star systems, and Enki told his son to conquer and expand their domains from there, in the direction toward Orion. Both Alpha Draconis and Ursa Minor were already occupied by star races, but Marduk had a huge amount of well-trained Dakh troops backing him up, and both star systems were taken by surprise and were relatively easily conquered. Ursa Minor and Draco were both Orion domains before Marduk conquered them and made the inhabitants into slaves and Dakh soldiers, with the purpose to expand his armada. Those who refused to follow Marduk were brutally killed and stripped of their avatars, meaning that their souls were doomed. Still, many died a heroic death, a death that was definite, rather than to join the traitor in his army against their own queen and king. Most, however, were too frightened to say no to Marduk. Thus, we have what many call the Dracos, the dragons of Alpha Draconis, and fiery dragons they are, former members of the Orion Empire and in blood tightly connected to the Dragon Queen herself, the Queen of the Stars. Note, there is another hypothesis that Isis was actually one of the ladies of fire in the Garden of Eden, still being Ninurta's daughter. However, Enki knew who she was as soon as he saw her, and raped her right there, and the son she bore from that rape was still Marduk. The two versions have the same outcome, and the only difference is when and where the rape had taken place. For the sake of our continuing story, it doesn't matter which version we subscribe to, the important thing is the rape, which will have, as we will see, some serious consequences. Also, the rape makes Marduk a bastard son. The Miners' Rebellion. After the marriage, there was a long period of peace on Gaia, and Lord Enki expanded his domains to Africa, North America, South America, and Europe. However, before the deluge, his palace stood in Eridu, in ancient Mesopotamia. It should be mentioned here because of its significance that although Enki was in charge of the Stargate of Saturn, it didn't mean that other beings couldn't enter Eridu, our solar system, if they wanted to take the chance. Enki's Dakh warriors were famous for their brutality, and everybody in this part of the universe knew who Lucifer was, and they knew about his brutal rebellion. Hence, very few star beings came past this way. Unfortunately for galactic business, Gaia sat like a plug in the middle of Peshmetan, the intergalactic highway, which many beings from everywhere in the universe who had business in the Milky Way galaxy chose in order to enter and exit the galaxy. This was of course bad business, both for Orion and for other smaller empires in our galaxy. However, all the star races had strict orders from Queen Nin not to interfere with what was happening on Gaia. There were many star species who objected to this. They wanted Lucifer gone from Eridu once and for all, but if someone tried to create a war with Prince Lucifer, it was also seen as a war declaration against Orion, which no one wanted. The reason for the Orion Queen to act like this was that she knew her son, and he had often showed the same pattern. If someone threatened him, and he saw that he was outnumbered, he would use the existing humans on Gaia as a shield and threaten to kill them if someone attacked. This was also the main reason why the Orion Empire, which otherwise could defeat Enki quite easily, didn't interfere. If they did, it would be the end of the Mother Goddess's experiment. At that time, before the flood, she was still thinking about other ways to get Lucifer out of there. On Gaia, the miners, especially in Africa and in South America, started complaining about long working hours and how badly they were treated. After all, they were Enki's people. Why did he treat them so cruelly? They hardly ever saw the light of day, and long hours in the mines wore them down. After a long time of accepting their situation, one day they rebelled. Enki didn't see it coming and was not really prepared, so the rebellion took a while to get under control, and many of the AIF workers died in the process. The mining crew was now quite reduced, and Enki needed more workers. Sitchin and others claimed that it was Enlil who was the tyrant who treated the miners badly, but this is not true. Enlil was not even on Earth at that time. Both Khan Enlil and Prince Enlil had business elsewhere. As we know, Enki had now determined who were dwelling on the other side of the mountains in the east. Hence, his next step was to find out how many ladies of fire were hiding in that domain. He already had a plan how to get in there without using force. How Enki did it is also written into our own mythology, so I am going to tell the story based both on mythology and then from a more direct viewpoint, which explains exactly what happened. Rape and manipulation in the Garden of Eden. As we know from before, the AIF, and almost all other beings, are interdimensional and know how to shapeshift. How this is done has been described in many of my previous papers. Shapeshifting was also what Lord Enki was going to use in order to get into what once was Prince Ninurta's paradise on Earth, his Garden of Eden. Greek mythology tells the Artemis story in quite some detail, so we are going to borrow from there to show what Enki did in the Garden of Eden. He patiently waited until a few ladies of fire showed up by the riverbed and quickly cloaked himself as Artemis, the mother goddess. In Greek mythology, the being who cloaked himself was Zeus, who we have proven in paper 2, and elsewhere, to be Lord Enki. Prince Ninurta was the one who had been given the responsibility for the living library and the Namlu, the androgynous human race, which the goddess was very proud of. Also, as the Artemis story tells us, Artemis was very protective of the chastity of her nymphs and was angered when they didn't keep their purity. In other words, the Lus, short for Namlu, were like the jewel in her crown. Prince Lucifer, as Enki, cloaked as Artemis, now used all of his actor skills and smooth talking to convince the nymphs that he was the goddess herself, who had returned to help her creation in this hopeless situation. He looked at them and found them enormously fair with their black skin, long red hair, glowing like fire, and their slender, perfect bodies. He couldn't help but admire this beautiful creation. Being bluffed by this false Artemis, the nymphs showed him the way into Eden. They removed the spell. Enki was making sure he understood how it was done, and led him into the most beautiful paradise that had ever been created. Even Enki was stunned when he saw the pure beauty in there. Clear, blue rivers were running through what seemed to be an endless landscape of forests, mountains, waterfalls, and wonderfully created gardens, with birds and animals in abundance. None of them bothered the other. There were no predators and there was no prey. All living things could still obtain their life energy from the sunlight. However, most beautiful of all were the nymphs, the primordial Luacutes. Enki looked around and saw that there were no males here. These ladies of fire were truly androgynous. However, this didn't mean they couldn't have sex with a male, and this is what the true Artemis meant when she said that she wanted them to keep their purity. In the mythology, there was one of the nymphs whose name was Callisto, and in Enki's eyes, she was the most attractive and adorable of all the nymphs he encountered in the Garden of Eden. So, as he'd done so often before, Enki used what he had between his legs, his serpent, and raped Callisto. Artemis became furious and appeared in the shape of a bear, blaming the rape on Callisto, and wanted to kill her. Thus, he had created the most horrible sin. He had raped one of the goddess' most precious nymphs. Not only that, his rape impregnated Callisto, and she bore him a child, the first child in the Garden of Eden that was born by male impregnation. The myth says further that the real Artemis became furious and appeared in the shape of a bear being a symbol for Orion, blamed the rape on Callisto, and wanted to kill her, apparently thinking that Callisto had intentionally decided to lose her purity. However, Zeus, Enki interfered at the last moment, throwing Callisto up in the stars, where she got her own constellation, Ursa Major, the Greater Bear. This is another interesting distortion of original records because, first, Ursa Major already belonged to the Orion Empire at the time, as we have seen when we had discussed the Galactic Wars, and Enki would never be able to confront the goddess and come out as the winner. Also, from having done my homework on the mother goddess and her basic character, she would never blame Callisto for being raped. However, as we shall see, this is a typical Enki trait. More than once has he protected rapists against their victims, something we will see in later papers, as well. Therefore, from doing my research, I find it much more evident that this part was inserted later by Enki himself. I am not stating this because I want to defend one being against another, but because I have learned what the characteristics of these beings are. By raping Callisto, he had now polluted this pure goddess bloodline with a semen, and he now knew his way into Eden. The magic and the spells that were used to protect Ninurta's paradise had now been decoded by Enki, and he understood the magic that was being used. Thus, he had a free passageway into the garden. Of course, the Artemis story is also a variety of the story about Adam and Eve, where Eve, Callisto, was seduced by Satan in the Garden of Eden, where Satan showed up as a snake, or should we say, with his snake, and seduced, raped, Eve. There was no Adam at that time. The rest of the story is partly told in Genesis in the Bible, with the horrendous crime excluded. Enki, the serpent, or Satan, in the Bible, in disguise of YHWH, Jehovah, Artemis, killed one of the nymphs, and stole a rib from her body, whereafter he snuck out of the garden. The rib, of course, contained the DNA of the Lady of Fire, and he and his consort, Isis, who was a highly trained scientist on her own merit, trained by her father, Ninurta, planned to use their own DNA to create more workers. Although Enki also had a much more hideous plan, which will be obvious in time, Enki was very careful so that the homicide in the garden would not be revealed to anybody, except for Isis. He told her that he wanted to create a hybrid race of workers, by crossing Namlu genes with those of existing apes, who had evolved on their own here on Gaia. Then they had to dumb them down by leaving most of their DNA dormant, so the workers would only be intelligent enough to understand orders, but not intelligent enough to comprehend who they were, and where they came from. Genetic manipulation, the Mars laboratories, and Con Angel's protest. Lord Enki could not forget the attractive nymphs in the garden, and every so often he sneaked in there when he wanted to play. The nymphs of course knew who he was by now, but they were peaceful beings, and although they were the first shamans on Gaia, they didn't know how to protect themselves from Enki's manipulative ways and the manner in which he managed to get to what he wanted. Eden, which had had its own, separate frequency level, isolated from the rest of the world since the AIF came, now found its frequency level decreasing, and it became harder and harder to maintain the magic of the mountain paradise which Ninurta had created. The last resort of what once was a planetary golden age was about to be utterly destroyed. I can't help but drawing parallels to J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, When the elves left Lothlorien and Middle-earth, the once so magical forests and rivers declined and merged with the new age of human rulership. The leaves fell from the trees, rivers dried out, and visitors to the once so mighty elf kingdom now found themselves walking in an abandoned forest with very few remnants of the glory that once was. By interfering with the development of the Nimlu and Ninurta-Zedin, a deep sadness fell over Mother Gaia, and from there on, the world would never be the same. In the heavens, rumors came to Khan Enlil and Queen Nin of what was happening on Gaia. There was really no way for Enki to hide what he was doing because Mother Earth, who is a manifestation of the goddess, knows what is happening on her own planet, and Enki should have known better. Deep inside, perhaps, he didn't care if they knew or not. He may have felt safe as long as he had the nymphs he could use as shields, if necessary. Khan Enlil got furious when he heard about what Enki had done, and here Zechariah Sitchin describes well what happened next. Enlil objected to Enki's plan. Don't create an Nibiran, ape-man slave class here on Earth. Enlil reminded Enki, on our planet, Nibiru, slavery has long ago been abolished. Tools are slaves, not other beings. Ninurta added that to get gold better, Enki should make machines, not slaves. Enki replied, Earthlings will be helpers, not slaves. Enlil still protested. Hybrid cloning was forbidden in the rules of planet-to-planet journeying. Enki's response: the team won't create a new species. Erectuses are the genetic ancestor. He evolves into us, Homo sapiens, the humans of Nibiru. We'll just speed him along a few million years. This is a quite revealing part of Sitchin's interpretations, and it deserves a few comments. The readers, who have read Sitchin, or my first level of learning, know about Sitchin's version of what Nibiru was and his interpretation that all the Anunnaki beings came from this one planet. Doing a little deeper research, we discover that this is a misleading presentation of what really happened. It becomes obvious when studying the mythology that is available to us, and I have also had the privilege to communicate with star beings who at times have helped me by pointing out the more likely path. Nevertheless, if we look at the above quote, we clearly see that Enlil, Khan, who has been accused of being the driving force behind creating a human slave race, in fact, verbally objected to Enki's plans, and in reality, he was very upset. In Sitchin's version, Enki replies that Earthlings, a very diminishing and intimidating term for humanity, will be helpers, not slaves. Right there, it clearly shows Enki's deceptive manners. History has showed us that he indeed created slaves and not helpers, because humans were manipulated into doing the AIF's hard work without getting any comparable rewards for it. In fact, these helpers had to work day and night in Lord Enki's service. Channeled entities, such as the Pleiadians, pretend to go along with defending human rights on this subject but always add that it's a co-creation, and that it was a choice. Not listening to anybody but just by observing, does it look like we had a choice in the matter? Not to me, anyway. A co-creation? Why would human souls agree to becoming slaves? Who wants to be a slave? As the readers can see, it doesn't make much sense, does it? Is it a co-creation if one part of the creative forces is manipulated into doing something? Not in my book. When Enlil still protests, Enki continues using his manipulative manners. To be able to really understand this text, we need to exchange Nibiru with Orion under some circumstances, such as when it comes to slavery. Slavery, says Enlil, has been forbidden in Orion for a long time, something Enki is well aware of. Although he believes he has a privilege by using the Ladies of Fire as shields, he still has some kind of respect left for his parents because he believes he'd rather have them on his side in this matter than to just go ahead, not caring about their opinions. Thus, he continues, saying that he will not really create a new race, he will just speed up the evolution of Homo erectus with a few million years. This, of course, as we know, was not what he really planned. and it was not at all what he actually did. The easiest way to spot a deceiver is to see if he or she walks the talk, or not. Enki certainly did not. Bringing up Nibiru and its need for gold to save its atmosphere couldn't be less of Enlil's concern. Nibiru was thrown out of orbit during the Syrian wars, and the inhabitants chose to side with the rebels. I seriously doubt that Enki even brought up Nibiru when communicating with the Orion Council. It is more likely something that Sitchin put there to fit into his story. The communication back and forth between Enki and the Orion Council, here led by Khan Enlil, ends with the council voting for Enki's plan. This is all according to Sitchin, of course. Therefore, let's think that over for a minute. Why would the Council of Orion vote for Enki's plan to create a human hybrid, whether it's from the DNA of the Namlu, or any other beings, when cloning and hybridization is strictly forbidden in Orion? Is it because Nibiru's atmosphere needs gold? Of course not. This is just a cover story. In reality, there is no way that Khan Enlil, Queen Min, or anybody else on the council would agree to genetically engineer a new species to become slave workers. This goes against all morals and ethics of the empire. This is also true for a few other reasons. First, this is a living library, and it is supposed to evolve into something great all by itself, without interference from outside. This has been stated over and over, not only by me, but by many others who have done their homework. Hence, there is no chance that Enki got approval to mess with the living library. Second, genetic engineering and genetic manipulation have nothing to do with creation at all. Yes, it is possible to use nanotechnology and subquantum physics in order to engineer, or manipulate, a species. It is done all the time here on Earth by humans when we breed different animal species with each other in a way that goes against nature. It is also done on humans in secret underground laboratories, in places such as Area 51 and Dulce. When a planet is seeded, it's done without technology, with the assistance of electricity, such as lightning, and bacteria and viruses, brought to the planet by colliding meteorites, etc. Technology has very little to do with it. Later in the planet's development, if the creator goddesses want to enhance intelligence, or other traits, into one of the species on the planet, they do so by inserting themselves into those particular beings and engineer them from the inside. No laboratories are needed. Therefore, a much more likely hypothesis is that Khan Enlil and the Council of Orion discovered at least some parts of Enki's plans and loudly protested against them. Enki, however, after having tried to manipulate them without success, went on without their consent, using his consort, Isis, as his co-scientist. Isis, after agreeing to Enki's idea to create a slave race without the consent of the Orion Empire, was, of course, no longer on good terms with Orion, and had, in their eyes, really showed her real nature. She continued working with Enki. The reason, as I see it, why Enki has left the above communication in the records is because he wanted future humans to believe that he had Orion's consent to create Homo sapiens sapiens, us, and he did us a favor by speeding up our evolution by millions of years. Nowhere does he mention that there was already an evolved humanoid species on Earth, which he, Enki, utterly destroyed and killed off in the process. As soon as they realized who the wolf in sheep's clothing was, the Namlu tried to flee. They were not safe in the sanctuary anymore. They were cloaking themselves, but were detected. Therefore, they tried to escape by literally going underground, and some of them succeeded in disappearing from Gaia's surface, and many of them haven't been seen since then. However, the majority of them were captured and put into slave labor deep down in the mines. This was a huge mistake for many reasons. They were ladies of fire, and their bodies were not built for such hard work. Many of them died down there in the mines, while they were whipped and tortured for not working fast enough. Although it must have happened on occasion, there were so-called Enki's loyal supervisors who made sure that the slave drivers were not raping the nymphs. Enki did not want the pure goddess bloodline of the Ladies of Fire mixed with his original workers. Now, when Enki, as Artemis, had stolen the rib from one of the nymphs, he and his consort could start working. However, they were not alone. Enki had a whole team of scientists brought with him to Gaia, so he set up laboratories both on Gaia and in the underground caverns of Mars. Mars had something which could almost be compared with industrial underground cities, with air trains driving around long distances between different departments that were spread out across these cities. There were not only the underground laboratories. When people lived down there, they had their needs for stores and conveniences, so things were built around that, as well. Nevertheless, everything circled around the genetic laboratories. Other than this, we know the stories of what happened next because I have told them in previous papers. In summary, Enki and Isis experimented a lot before they found a worker that fit their purposes, and while they were at it, they also created hybrids that could work as maids for the gods and as farmers, builders, and much more. Prince Ninurta, who had nurtured the original living library for many eons, must have been both devastated and furious when he found out that his own genes, via his daughter, Isis, were used to create mankind. This must have been the ultimate insult to him, not because he had ill feelings toward mankind, but because the manipulators were using his genes to create something that was both illegal and less evolved than what he had helped create in the past. In their attempt to create robust workers, Enki and Isis tried everything from centaurs, minotaurs, to giants, who could lift enormous rocks and stones, but they were not very pleased with their result. Some of these creatures and monsters couldn't sustain themselves in the third-dimensional frequency band, so they suddenly just failed to thrive and died, while others went insane, attacked their supervisors and other workers, and had to be killed on the spot. These races were soon terminated, and new ones were tried in their place. Others didn't fit as mine workers but could be used as giant packing animals, and AIF managers could be seen riding on centaurs around the gigantic mines for some time. Eventually, Enki and Isis decided on humanoids after all. They realized that the humanoid life template was the most reliable and started developing that instead. Eventually, after many discarded prototypes, Enki had a worker ready, which was asexual and could not reproduce. This meant that new workers had to be cloned, and they all looked the same. The AIF workers, however, were released from their duties and were happy not having to go down into the mines again. Here I need to fill in that mining operations are not at all unusual in the universe. Almost every star in the universe has planets around them, and these planets are all unique, with their own minerals and precious stones in the huge mix. Star races often claim planets with a lot of interesting and attractive resources for themselves and make them their real estate. Then they start mining them and emptying them of resources, which they then sell on the galactic and intergalactic market. Planets with moons also often have these moons mined. However, moons are not as common as people may think. Most of them are artificial in one way or another. They are often satellites brought in from elsewhere in order to stabilize the planet and to keep the planet on a certain orbit around its sun. The AIF did a lot of mining all over our own solar system, particularly on the moons that surround the bigger gas giants. Although most of the mines are abandoned now, there is still some mining going on out there. Whether the AIF used any of the gold to enhance Nibiru's atmosphere or not, I am not sure. If they did, it was just a small amount that went there. What the AIF saw was that Gaia, literally, was an incredible gold mine and had an abundance of other minerals, precious stones, and other useful resources that could be traded on the universal market. Gold in itself, as I've mentioned elsewhere, was used almost like cocaine by the gods. Inhaled correctly, and contrary to cocaine, it increased their lifespan tremendously. It was not only the gold that made them live much longer, however, it was a mix of things, but gold had a lot to do with it. After some time, Using the new hybrids in the mining business and elsewhere, it became hard to keep up with creating clones. Slaves sometimes died like flies down in the mines, and the mining managers complained that they couldn't get enough workers. That's when Enki and Isis created Adapa, the hybrid that could reproduce. They were the first male-female human race on Earth. Thus, it can be stated that the goddess created womankind, and Enki and Isis created mankind. The first Adapa had black skin, and the reason for this was twofold. The engineers had used genes from Homo erectus, who were not necessarily black, but the Namlu were. So, by using the DNA of the ladies of fire and Homo erectus and mix from some other star beings, as the legend states, the result became the first human species that could reproduce, and that race was black. Therefore, contrary to what has been said earlier, the black race was here before Enki arrived on Gaia, in the form of the Namlu. Many of us have probably often thought about all these different races of humans here on Earth. Some are black, others are white, red, yellow, brown, or any shade in between. Where do they all come from? In fact, we know that Enki and his AIF have been in charge here for the last 500,000 years, and during that period, in general, only star races who have had Enki's consent have been allowed to visit Gaia. Therefore, the hypothesis many have that all these races were created because a multitude of beings were here and copulated with mankind, falls on its own merit. Instead, Enki and Isis created variations of the black Adapa as they went along, and they were used for different purposes. The black race was used for mining, in Africa and South America in particular, and then abandoned. A new race, let's say the white race, was created with slightly different DNA mixture and was used for other types of labor. Many America Indian tribes, the Red People, claim that their ancestors come from the Pleiades, while the Dogon tribe in Africa say they had Syrian visitors in the past. Some have suggested that the Asian people have DNA of the Greys in them because of the shape of their eyes and the fact that many of them are shorter than, let's say, the white man, but if that is true or not, I don't know because most of the Greys are not even biological entities. This time, it worked much better. The Adapa was allowed to reproduce, under supervision, but just as with the first hybrids, they had their DNA deactivated to a large degree, and just like us, they used less than 5% of their brains on average. The gods did not want them to be like them, they didn't want them to start longing for eternal life and thirst for knowledge. They were slaves, period. They were smart enough to take orders, and execute them, but stupid enough not to ask intelligent questions. The majority of these experiments took place on Mars, and the workers were then transported from our sister planet down to Gaia. People have wondered why they bothered with that when they could do it all down here on our planet, and the answer is not clear. However, if I may make a qualified guess, it would be that they did not want Mother Gaia to know what they were doing with her nymphs until they were all ready for the mines, and then it was too late. From the Adapa, the AIF scientists did refinements and readjustments to their experiment as they went along, until they had the perfect worker, and the experiment stopped for a while. When the mining industry worked as it should, however, and more mines had been opened around the world, the next part of Enki's plan was executed, and that was to create soldiers, foot soldiers. Then, the whole genetic manipulation industry was taken to a new level. Enki wanted to create strong and enduring soldiers who were loyal to their masters and had the bravery of the Dakh warriors but were stronger and larger in size. Measurements were made in the atmosphere and in the electromagnetic field to determine how tall and how heavy these soldiers could be. If possible, he wanted to make them even stronger than the giants that he had created for the mining project that, unfortunately, had failed. However, if he moved the moon a little bit closer to Earth again, the planet could eventually be able to host some larger beings. That was done, and now Enki had an additional idea. By the time he fled from Orion, after he had been cast out of heaven, he created some giant hybrids in the Pleiades. These Pleiadian beings lived on larger planets than that of Gaia, and many of them were of impressive stature. Enki sent a message to them and invited some of them to come to Gaia, which they did. Just like the rest of the AIF, they were interdimensional beings and were able to nano-travel. However, according to the Pleiadians themselves, channeled by Barbara Marciniak, they also brought gigantic spaceships with them, which they parked in orbit around Earth. When the Pleiadians saw the women of Earth, the first thing they thought of was how beautiful they were. Many thought that the Earth women were the most beautiful women in their known universe and found them irresistible. In Level 2, I told the Pleiadians' own story from their lectures of how they started mating with the human women, and I suggested that these giant beings, although they could use their avatars to mate with our women, that was most likely not how it was done. A better hypothesis is that they took on human male bodies, either as babies, a human lifetime was nothing for them, or they became so-called walk-ins, where they took over a male body from an already occupied body, and either threw out the original soul essence or made him dormant, while taking over the control of the body. However they did it, the Earth women apparently found the male intruders attractive as well, and in their ignorance, they didn't mind copulating with them. If this is true, or only a made-up myth from the Pleiadians themselves in ancient times to justify their crime, is difficult to say, but we also know that it was always considered an honor for a woman to sleep with one of the gods, which of course is mind control and pure manipulation. There is a known fact by now, however, that at least some of the Pleiadians had the giant gene, and that gene was used in the genetic laboratories in order to create giants. Although the giant skulls and skeletons that have been found over the decades and the centuries all over the world are constantly being debunked by certain authorities, the fact remains that such remnants have been found. The museum outside Lima, Peru, carries typical examples of giant, elongated skulls that have been found, mostly in the Lima region. Complete giant graves have been found as well. Some of them have been raided over the years, but there are a few that are at least partly intact. Stephen Quayle, who has spent much of his life researching giants, has many interesting things to show on his website. Although some of the pictures he is showing are questionable, in my opinion, many of them are evidently authentic. Another excellent researcher on giant skulls, and giants in general, is Brian Forrester. Google him, and you will find some amazing videos. I have referred to him before. By mixing genes from the already existing Adapa and the Pleiadians, the giants of Genesis 6 in the Bible were created. Apparently, Enki and his team had a lot of fun with this because giants in all different sizes were suddenly walking the earth. Some of them became fearsome and furious warriors, others became some of the first kings to rule for the AIF in different parts of the world, while others became strong and excellent builders. In these days, Gaia was a strange planet to visit because there were a myriad of different experiments walking around on the planet at the same time, and many of these species did not get along very well with each other. Therefore, there were many wars between gods, men, and monsters.